Think of boarding a routine flight, expecting to land safely, only for tragedy to strike within minutes. A fiery crash that leaves 179 people dead and just 2 survivors. It's South Korea's deadliest aviation disaster in decades, shaking the nation and the world. How did something so catastrophic happen in such a short span of time? It's hard to wrap your head around something as devastating as the Jeju air crash that happened this past Sunday in South Korea. When you hear the numbers, 179 lives lost, only 2 survivors, it's impossible not to feel a lump in your throat. For a country that hasn't seen a disaster of this magnitude in aviation since 1997, the shock is overwhelming. It's not just about the loss of life, it's the kind of tragedy that shakes a nation to its core and leaves people searching for answers. The flight, Jeju Air 7C 2216, was a Boeing 737-800 carrying 181 people. It was coming back from Thailand and was supposed to land at Muan International Airport, a relatively quiet spot in the southwestern part of the country. The crash happened just after 9 a.m., in what seemed like an ordinary moment that quickly turned catastrophic. A bird strike warning had been issued to the pilot just minutes before, which might sound routine. Airports near water or wildlife habitats often deal with this kind of thing. But what followed was anything but ordinary. The pilot acknowledged the warning and radioed in a distress call shortly after, saying, "Mayday, mayday, mayday, bird strike, going around." It was clear something was wrong. Instead of completing the initial landing attempt, the pilot decided to circle around and try to approach from a different direction. That kind of maneuver isn't uncommon in tricky situations, but what unfolded next was horrific. The plane attempted to land from the opposite direction, coming in from north to south. For reasons that investigators are still trying to figure out, the landing gear wasn't deployed. The plane hit the ground hard, skidding down the runway, and then slammed into a concrete wall before bursting into flames. The scene was described as pure chaos. Witnesses reported hearing loud bangs, followed by a fireball that engulfed the aircraft. One witness, Lee Gyun-young, who owns a restaurant nearby, managed to record the crash on his phone. His description of the event was chilling. He could feel the heat on his face, comparing it to steam rising in a sauna. You can only imagine the fear and confusion in those moments, both for the people on the ground watching helplessly and for those inside the plane. The aftermath was just as heart-wrenching. Rescue teams worked quickly, but the devastation was immense. Among the 181 people on board, only 2 survived. Flight attendants who were seated near the back of the plane. One of them, identified as Lee, a 33-year-old man, is now in the hospital, awake and communicating despite multiple fractures. The other survivor, a 25-year-old woman named Koo, suffered injuries to her head and ankle but is said to be stable. The other 179 souls on board, 175 passengers, and 4 crew members didn't make it. Think about that for a second. 179 people who boarded that flight expecting to land safely, now gone. It's incomprehensible. What makes this even harder to process is how quickly everything went wrong. This wasn't a drawn-out series of events. From the time the bird strike warning was issued to the moment the plane burst into flames, only minutes had passed. It raises so many questions. Could this have been prevented? Was it just a freak accident? Or were there deeper issues at play? Right now, nobody has definitive answers. The crash has drawn parallels to a Korean air disaster in 1997, where a Boeing 747 went down in Guam, claiming 228 lives. That incident led to sweeping reforms in aviation safety in South Korea. But here we are again, faced with another tragedy. For many, it feels like déjà vu, but worse. The impact of this crash goes beyond the numbers. Families are grieving, their lives turned upside down in an instant. All the passengers, except for 2 Thai nationals, were South Korean. The government has declared a week of mourning, and tributes are pouring in from all over the world. President Joe Biden expressed his condolences, saying he and his wife Jill were deeply saddened, and that the U.S. was ready to help in any way. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said her heart was broken by the news, and Germany's President Frank-Walter Steinmeier described the tragedy as yet another blow to the nation's heart. It's not just world leaders offering their sympathies. Ordinary people are grappling with what this means. There's fear, of course. Some reports say thousands of passengers have canceled their Jeju air flights since the crash. But there's also frustration. Family members of the victims are already voicing their concerns about the lack of updates and transparency in the investigation. They deserve answers, and they deserve them quickly. For now, all we have are fragments of information and the heavy weight of this tragedy. Investigators are hard at work trying to piece together what went wrong, but these things take time. 2 black boxes, the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, have been recovered, but one is damaged, which complicates things. It might even need to be sent to the US for further analysis, which could take months. Trying to understand what went wrong in the Jeju air crash feels like trying to piece together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Everyone is asking the same question: how did something like this happen? And honestly, the more you look into it, the more complicated it gets. This wasn't just one thing going wrong. It seems like a chain reaction of problems that spiraled out of control in the worst possible way. Let's start with the bird strike theory, because that's been at the center of a lot of speculation. Bird strikes happen more often than you'd think, especially at airports near water or wildlife habitats, like Muan International Airport. Ducks, geese, you name it, they're a constant presence. In fact, the control tower issued a bird strike warning to the pilot just before things went south. But here's the thing. While bird strikes are dangerous and can definitely damage an engine, they don't usually lead to an entire plane crashing. At least, that's what aviation experts like Jeffrey Thomas are saying. He pointed out that bird strikes on their own wouldn't stop a pilot from deploying the landing gear or controlling the plane enough to avoid disaster. So, if it wasn't just the birds, what else could it have been? The black boxes, the flight data recorder, and the cockpit voice recorder are going to be key to figuring this out. These devices are like the memory of the plane, recording everything that happens during a flight. But even here, there's a snag. One of the black boxes was damaged in the crash, which means analyzing it won't be quick or easy. South Korea might even have to send it to the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, for further examination, and that could take months. It's frustrating because everyone wants answers now, but investigations like this take time, especially when the evidence is incomplete. There's also a lot of talk about how the plane was handled in those final moments. Why didn't the landing gear come down? That's one of the biggest mysteries. When the pilot decided to go around for another attempt, everything should have been reset and prepared for a proper landing. But for some reason, the gear wasn't deployed when the plane touched down. Gregory Alegi, an aviation expert, pointed out other oddities too, like why the plane was moving so fast and why the flaps weren't open, which are both essential for a safe landing. It's almost like the usual safety protocols weren't followed, but why that happened is still unclear. And then there's the question of weather. While the reports haven't highlighted any extreme conditions, even moderate weather issues can add another layer of complexity during a landing. Was there unexpected turbulence or wind shear? Did it affect visibility or the plane's stability? Investigators will be looking into this as they analyze the data, but so far, nothing definitive has been reported. Still, in aviation, even small factors can combine to create catastrophic outcomes, so it's not something they'll overlook. One thing that's especially troubling is the possibility of mechanical failure. The Boeing 737-800 is a reliable aircraft, used all over the world, but no plane is perfect. This particular model has been around for years. On average, they're about 13 years old, and the last one rolled off the production line 5 years ago. While it's not as notorious as the 737 MAX, which was grounded worldwide after 2 deadly crashes in 2018 and 2019, any aircraft this old requires meticulous maintenance. Could there have been an unnoticed issue with the landing gear or the control systems? That's another avenue investigators are exploring. The pilot's decision-making is under scrutiny too. Now, it's easy for us to speculate from the outside, but being in that cockpit, facing a potential bird strike, Trying to land with a damaged plane, that's a level of pressure most of us can't even imagine. Still, aviation experts and investigators will be asking tough questions. Should the pilot have handled the situation differently? Were there signs of trouble earlier that could have prompted an emergency landing elsewhere? These are questions that only the investigation can answer, but they're crucial for preventing something like this from happening again. Another layer to all this is how Jeju Air and Boeing are reacting. Jeju Air's reputation has taken a huge hit. Their shares dropped over 8% right after the crash, and AK Holdings, the company that owns them, hit a 16-year low. Thousands of passengers canceled their flights with Jeju Air, which isn't surprising given the circumstances. The fear and uncertainty this crash has created will take a long time to fade, if it ever does. Boeing, on the other hand, is dealing with another round of scrutiny. After the 737 MAX debacle, the company has been trying to rebuild trust, but incidents like this make people question whether their planes are as safe as they claim. What really stands out, though, is how much is still unknown. The crash has sparked a massive investigation involving both South Korean authorities and U.S. experts from the NTSB. They're combing through every detail, from the bird strike warning to the state of the aircraft to the pilot's actions. It's not just about finding out what happened, it's about making sure it never happens again. That's why South Korea's acting president, Choi Sang-mok, has ordered emergency safety inspections for all Boeing 737-800s in the country. It's a step in the right direction, but it's also a reminder of how fragile trust in aviation can be. This crash has raised so many questions, and for now, the answers are elusive. Was it a combination of bird strikes, mechanical failure, and human error? Was it something entirely unexpected? We won't know until the investigation is complete, and even then, it's possible some details will remain unclear. What we do know is that aviation, as safe as it generally is, still has risks. It's a field that depends on precision, technology, and human judgment. And when any part of that system falters, the consequences can be devastating. When something as tragic as the Jeju Air crash happens, it's impossible not to feel the weight of it. You think about the people on board, their families, and even the survivors who are left to carry the memories of such a horrifying event. But tragedies like this also make you stop and think about what can be done to ensure it doesn't happen again. It's not just about answers, it's about action. And in this case, the world is watching how South Korea and the aviation industry respond. Let's start with the survivors, because their stories are nothing short of miraculous. Can you imagine being one of only 2 people to make it out alive from a disaster like this? One of them, a flight attendant named Lee, is awake and communicating despite multiple fractures. The other, Koo, is stable, but still recovering from injuries to her head and ankle. The fact that they were seated near the back of the plane likely played a role in their survival, since that part of the aircraft didn't take the brunt of the impact. It's heartbreaking to think about how close they were to so many lives lost. But their survival also gives us a small glimmer of hope in an otherwise dark story. For the families of the victims, though, the pain is unimaginable. Most of the passengers were South Korean, with only 2 Thai nationals on board. The government has declared a 7-day mourning period, but no amount of official recognition can fill the void left by such a loss. Families are frustrated, and you can't blame them. They're demanding answers, updates, and accountability. It's hard to lose someone so suddenly and tragically, and even harder when you feel like you're being left in the dark about why it happened. The aviation industry, meanwhile, is grappling with the fallout. Jeju Air is at the center of it all, and their response will likely define their future. Shares in the airline have plummeted, and public trust has taken a huge hit. Thousands of passengers have canceled their flights, and you can understand why. Who wouldn't second-guess stepping onto one of their planes after this? It's not just about fixing what went wrong in this crash. It's about convincing people that flying with them is safe again. Boeing, too, is in the hot seat. The 737-800 has been a workhorse of the skies for years, but every crash raises questions about its reliability. It's not the same as the 737 MAX, which had its own share of scandals, but it's still enough to make people wonder. Are older planes being maintained properly? Are there flaws that we don't know about yet? For Boeing, this is another blow to their already fragile reputation, and it's going to take more than reassurances to win back public confidence. One of the most significant outcomes of this disaster is the push for stricter safety regulations. South Korea's acting president has already ordered emergency inspections of all Boeing 737-800s in the country. That's a start, but it's clear that more needs to be done. Bird strikes, for example, are a known hazard at many airports. So, why aren't there better systems in place to detect and mitigate them? Could advanced radar or other technology have made a difference here? These are the kinds of questions that need to be asked and answered. It's also a moment for the aviation industry worldwide to take a hard look at its emergency protocols. Were the pilots trained for a situation like this? Did they have all the tools they needed to handle the challenges they faced? Aviation is one of the safest modes of transport, but incidents like this remind us that there's always room for improvement. Whether it's better training, more rigorous maintenance checks, or updated technology, there's no excuse not to make changes when lives are at stake. But let's not forget the human side of this. It's easy to focus on the technical details and the broader implications, but at its heart, this tragedy is about people. The victims, their families, and even the responders who rushed to the scene deserve to be remembered and supported. The country's 7-day mourning period is a sign of respect, but it's only the beginning. Tributes, memorials, and continued support for the survivors and the victims' families will be crucial in the weeks and months to come. On a global level, this crash has highlighted just how interconnected we all are. World leaders have expressed their condolences, with President Joe Biden offering support and European Commission, President Ursula von der Leyen calling the crash heartbreaking. It's a reminder that when something like this happens, it's not just one country that feels the impact, it's the whole world. Aviation connects us, and when something goes wrong, it ripples across borders in ways we might not always think about. At the same time, the crash has raised some tough questions about the aviation industry's priorities. Safety should always come first, but with the pressures of profitability and tight schedules, is that really the case? Incidents like this force us to ask whether enough is being done to balance business interests with passenger safety. It's a conversation that needs to happen, not just in South Korea, but everywhere. As we move forward, the hope is that the lessons from this tragedy will lead to real change. Investigations take time, but once the results are in, there's no excuse for inaction. Whether it's addressing bird strike risks, improving pilot training, or ensuring that older planes are still up to standard, every recommendation needs to be taken seriously. This can't just be another disaster that fades into the background once the news cycle moves on. For now, though, we're left with the grief, the questions, and the hope that something good can come out of something so devastating. The Jeju air crash is a stark reminder of how fragile life is and how much we depend on the systems we've built to keep us safe. It's up to all of us, governments, airlines, manufacturers, and even passengers, to push for better standards and demand accountability. Lives depend on it, and after a tragedy like this, that's something none of us should forget. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.